2 days. He hasn't said a word. I'm done babysitting him. So what now? Now we send in the new girl. Room 411's yours. Try not to cry. Noted. You're signing. My name is Maya. What do you need? What is she doing? I don't know. He's never done that with any of us. Okay, I will.
They handed her the one patient they were sure she couldn't handle. They had no idea she was the only one who could. For 2 days, Desmond Whitfield lay in that hospital bed unable to speak a single word, and not one person on that floor stopped long enough to ask why. They assumed he was confused. They assumed he was difficult. They rolled their eyes when his hands moved and wrote it off as agitation, because none of them had ever taken the time to learn what those movements actually meant. What none of them knew, and what none of them cared to find out, was that the man in that bed had lost his voice to a stroke only days earlier, and that somewhere underneath the hospital gown and the beeping machines was one of the wealthiest men in the entire state, admitted under a name nobody recognized, with no family in the room and no assistant who yet knew which hospital to call. Maya Turner was 24 years old, and she had learned to read hands before she had learned to read words. Her mother, Denise Turner, had raised her alone and raised her deaf, and every single day of Maya's childhood had been spent translating the world for the one person who loved her most. By the time Maya became a nurse, she had a language most of her coworkers assumed she would never need on that floor, a language she rarely mentioned because nobody had ever asked, and a quiet confidence that the senior staff mistook for something to be corrected rather than something to be respected. Before we go any further, I want to be honest with you. I do not know your name, but I know that a story like this only exists because somebody like you stays to hear it. Please subscribe, like, and share this with someone who could use a good story tonight. And if you have a moment, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Your city, your country, whatever you are comfortable sharing. I go through every single one, and I respond personally. Thank you for staying. Because I should warn you now, this story does not end the way you think it does. There is something she does not know about him, and by the time you find out, you will understand why I had to tell it. To understand what that moment actually meant, you have to go back to a small apartment on the east side of the city, where Maya Turner grew up as the only hearing person in a house of two. Her mother, Denise, had been deaf since birth, and had raised Maya entirely on her own after Maya's father left before she could remember his face. There was no one else to translate the mail, the doctor's appointments, the landlord's complaints, the school conferences, so from the time Maya was 5 years old, that job belonged to her. She grew up standing between her mother and a world that rarely slowed down long enough to meet her halfway, and she learned, long before she understood the word for it, that most people simply did not bother to look closely at anyone they had already decided was not worth the effort. Denise never once complained about the world's impatience, not in front of Maya. She ran a small tailoring business out of their apartment, her hands doing the talking her voice never could, and she raised her daughter to believe that being overlooked by people who couldn't be bothered to understand you said everything about them and nothing about you. It was Denise who encouraged Maya toward nursing, not despite her ability to sign, but because of it. There will be people in this world, Denise signed to her the night Maya got her acceptance letter, who nobody else has bothered to reach. You already know how to reach them. Nursing school nearly broke that promise before it began. Maya's acceptance came with a tuition bill neither she nor Denise could touch, and for 3 sleepless weeks, Maya prepared herself to defer, to work another year stitching hems beside her mother and reapply when the numbers made more sense. Then a letter arrived from a small private foundation neither of them had heard of, offering a full scholarship earmarked specifically for hearing children of deaf parents pursuing careers in patient care. No essay beyond a single paragraph required, no interview, no strings. Denise cried reading it aloud and signed, over and over, unable to understand why anyone would hand her daughter a future for nothing in return. Maya never learned who funded it. The letterhead carried only a small, unfamiliar name attached to no public face and no explanation, and she carried that unanswered gratitude with her through every unpaid extra shift, every senior nurse who talked over her. Every time she was handed the hardest patients with the least explanation, telling herself that one day, somehow, she would find a way to pass it forward. What Denise did not know, and what Maya had told no one, was that a letter of a very different kind had been sitting folded inside Maya's locker for 11 days by the time she was handed the assignment in room 411. 2 years of Patrice's corrections and reassignments and laughter down the hallway had worn something down in her that she was not proud of, and the week before, after a shift that ended with Patrice mocking her in front of a patient's family, Maya had gone home and written out her resignation, careful and formal, planning to hand it in the following Friday. She had not told her mother. She had not told anyone. She had simply decided, quietly, the way she decided most things, that she had given this floor 2 years of trying, and that trying had not been enough to earn even the smallest measure of respect. The letter was still folded in her locker on the morning Patrice sent her into that room, and it would still be there, and signed and undelivered, for 3 more days after that. Desmond Whitfield's story started in a very different house, but it bent, without either of them knowing it, toward the exact same lesson. He was the oldest of 2, and his younger sister Alana had been born deaf, in a family that treated it, from the very beginning, as simply one more fact about her rather than a tragedy to be managed. Desmond learned to sign before he learned cursive, translating for Alana at school assemblies and church services the same way Maya would one day translate for her mother at a dentist's office. But there was one afternoon, when Desmond was 15 and desperate in the particular way only teenagers can be desperate to belong, that he did not translate. A group of boys he wanted badly to impress had gathered outside a corner store, and Alana had come running up beside him, signing rapidly, excited about something small and forgettable now, and Desmond, for exactly the length of one held breath, pretended not to understand his own sister's hands. He laughed off her gestures as nothing, changed the subject with his mouth while her fingers were still moving, and watched her small face fold in on itself before she turned and walked home alone. He apologized to her that same night, and she forgave him within the hour, the way children forgive the people who love them best. But Desmond never fully forgave himself, and when Alana passed decades later from an illness that took her slowly enough for him to sit beside her hospital bed for months, that one afternoon outside the corner store was the memory that surfaced most, uninvited, at 3 in the morning, for years afterward. He built his foundation in her name not long after, funding scholarships and interpreter programs across a dozen states, and he made certain, every single time, that his own name never once appeared attached to any of it. It was not modesty. It was penance, quiet and ongoing, for a debt he had decided could never actually be paid off, only continued. By the time Desmond built the company that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest men in the state, the language he and Alana had shared had gone quiet in his daily life, the way a room goes quiet after someone leaves it. He kept it, technically. His hands still remembered the shapes. But he had not truly needed it in over 20 years. Not until the morning a blood vessel in his brain gave way without warning, and he woke up in a hospital bed with every word he had ever known still fully intact in his mind, and no way left to make a single one of them heard. Patrice Dunmore had run that floor for 11 years, and in all that time, she had never once been questioned by anyone beneath her, until a 24-year-old nurse with secondhand shoes and a quiet voice showed up expecting to be treated like she belonged. What none of the other nurses on that floor ever knew about Patrice, because she made absolutely certain they never would, was that she had a younger brother named Curtis, born with a developmental disability that had made his childhood a long series of institutions and specialists deciding, again and again, that he simply was not worth the extra effort his care would have required. Patrice had spent her own adolescence fighting schools, fighting doctors, fighting a system that treated her brother as an inconvenience dressed up in paperwork, and she had promised herself, somewhere around 16 years old, that she would never again stand by while someone was written off as too difficult to bother understanding. Then Curtis died at 19, in a group home that had ignored a documented medical need for 3 straight days, The exact same kind of quiet, bureaucratic neglect that would one day nearly cost Desmond Whitfield his life. Patrice never spoke of it. Not to her co-workers, not to her supervisors, not even, most days, to herself. Instead, the promise she had made as a teenager curdled slowly into something else entirely, a hardened, exhausted cynicism that told her the world simply did not change, that softness only got people hurt, and that the fastest way to survive 11 years on a floor like this one was to stop expecting better from anyone, including herself. She had decided within the first week that Maya did not belong, and she made sure Maya knew it every single shift after that. Not because she had forgotten what it felt like to be dismissed, but because some deeply buried part of her could no longer stand to watch someone else try as hard as she once had and risk losing just as much. When Desmond Whitfield was brought into that hospital, he had no assistant with him, no security detail, no family. Only an ambulance crew who had found him alone in his car on the shoulder of a service road, unable to speak, unable to explain what was happening to him. His wallet had been in his coat, not his hand, and the intake nurse that first night, rushed and overwhelmed on a short-staffed shift, had typed his name into the system slightly wrong, transposing 2 letters in a way that would take his assistant, Marcus Bell, more than 2 full days to untangle. Desmond had insisted on privacy for most of his adult life, keeping his public profile deliberately thin, traveling under alternate names for exactly the kind of reason nobody could have predicted matching in a moment like this. And that same instinct, the one that had protected him for decades, was now the exact thing standing between him and anyone who might have recognized his name. The first day, the attending physician noted in his chart that the patient appeared confused and uncooperative, unable to communicate coherently, most likely due to the trauma of the stroke itself. Desmond spent that entire first day signing the same handful of desperate requests to anyone who entered his room. A phone, a pen, someone who understood him. Nurses glanced at his moving hands the way you glance at a television left on in another room, present but not worth attending to, and moved on to check his vitals and leave again. By evening, he had stopped trying with most of them, conserving what little strength he had for the moment someone new walked in, hoping, each time, that this one might be different. By the second day, the notes in his chart had shifted from confused to agitated. There was a specific moment, mid-morning, when a young orderly bringing his breakfast tray paused just long enough that Desmond's hands moved fast and hopeful, forming careful, deliberate letters, spelling out his own name one precise shape at a time. The orderly smiled the uncomfortable smile people give when they don't know what else to do, set the tray down, and left without a single word, already late for his next task. Desmond sat with the tray untouched for nearly an hour afterward, staring at his own hands as though they had failed him rather than the room full of people who had failed to look at them. It happened again that afternoon with a different nurse, and again that evening with a physical therapist who mistook his signing for a symptom to note rather than a sentence to answer, and by the time the second day ended, Desmond had stopped raising his hands at all for anyone new who walked through that door. It was Patrice Dunmore who cemented that reputation into something closer to a joke. By the second day, she had grown openly resentful of what she called his theatrics, complaining to anyone who would listen that some men simply believed the rules did not apply to them. She did not know his name. She did not know what had happened to him. She only knew that he made her job harder, and that was, in her mind, more than enough reason to stop trying. When her shift supervisor mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the newest nurse on the floor was due for a rotation into a harder assignment, Patrice saw her chance, and she took it with something close to relish. She told Maya nothing about the 2 wasted days. She told her nothing about the confusion in his chart or the assumptions layered on top of assumptions. She simply handed her the room number, told her to try not to cry, and stepped back into the hallway with her phone already rising, certain, the way she had been certain of very little else in her life, that she already knew exactly how this was going to go. What happened next, you already watched. Maya walked into that room expecting nothing more than another difficult assignment, and within seconds, everything Patrice thought she understood about that patient, about that nurse, about how this story was supposed to end, came apart in front of a phone she had raised to film someone else's failure. Marcus Bell had not slept more than a handful of hours in 2 days. He was Desmond's chief of staff, the closest thing to family Desmond had left, and when his employer failed to show up for a scheduled call on the morning of the stroke, Marcus's first instinct had been panic, followed almost immediately by a methodical, exhausting search. He started with the hospital's nearest Desmond's last known location, calling each intake desk with the same careful description, only to be told, again and again, that no patient matching that description had been admitted, because the name in every hospital system was not the name Marcus was searching for. He tried the airports next, in case Desmond had somehow made it to a flight. He tried Desmond's private physician, his lawyer, even an old college roommate Desmond hadn't spoken to in a decade, chasing down every thread that might explain a silence this complete from a man who was never silent for more than an hour without warning. Somewhere in the middle of that second sleepless night, Marcus made a call to Desmond's company's board chair, a woman named Iris Calloway who had known Desmond for nearly 2 decades and did not panic easily. She did not panic on this call either, but she asked, quietly, whether this needed to become a matter for the full board, whether the company's stock, which moved on Desmond's public appearances more than either of them liked to admit, needed to be prepared for an announcement of any kind. Marcus told her not yet, that he would find him first, and hung up before she could ask the question neither of them wanted to say out loud, whether there would even be anything left to announce. It was pure exhausted persistence, and a highway patrol report Marcus finally located describing an abandoned vehicle on a service road that led him, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, to the hospital nearest that exact stretch of highway. The front desk clerk who greeted him, running purely on hospital policy rather than any instinct for the situation in front of her, informed him politely that patient information could not be released without proper authorization, regardless of how urgent his description sounded, and asked him to fill out a form and wait. Marcus did not raise his voice. He simply set his phone on the counter, opened to a photograph of Desmond from a company event 2 years earlier, and asked the clerk to walk it back to whoever was currently treating the unidentified patient in the stroke unit and asked them, directly, if the face matched. She hesitated, then did exactly that, and returned 4 minutes later with an administrator whose expression had changed completely. Word moved through that hospital faster than any code blue ever could. Within the hour, the same nurses who had spent 2 days rolling their eyes at room 411 were being quietly informed, one supervisor at a time, exactly whose bedside they had been standing beside without knowing it, and exactly how thin the line had been between negligence and something far more serious. If you are still with me, thank you. Drop a comment and let me know what you would have done in Maya's place. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Patrice Dunmore was called into the hospital administrator's office before her shift even ended. She sat across a desk that suddenly felt much smaller than it had that morning, and she was asked, plainly, why a patient's documented communication needs had gone unaddressed for 2 full days on her watch. She started to give the answer she always gave, that the floor was short-staffed, that he had been combative, that nobody could have known. And then, for reasons she could not entirely explain even to herself, she stopped mid-sentence and told the administrator about Curtis instead, about the group home, about the 3 days nobody came. She had never said his name out loud in that building in 11 years of working there, and hearing herself say it now, in the middle of defending her own failure, felt less like an excuse and more like a confession she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was still heavy. Desmond Whitfield's recovery took the better part of 2 months, and for every single day of it, he refused to be assigned any nurse other than Maya Turner. He made the request formally, through Marcus. The very first afternoon, an administrator finally sat down with him properly and took the time to write down what he was signing rather than guessing at it. The hospital, eager in the way institutions become eager once they understand exactly who they nearly failed, accommodated him without a single question asked. There was a particular morning, 3 weeks into his recovery, when Desmond taught Maya a sign she had never seen before, a small, specific gesture Alana had invented as a child for their mother's Sunday pancakes, a private joke between siblings that had outlived both the joke and the sister who made it. Maya practiced it slowly, and when she finally got the shape right, Desmond's whole face changed in a way she had not seen from him before, somewhere between grief and gratitude, as though a small piece of his sister had just been handed back to him by someone who had never met her. It was that same week that Desmond, watching Maya more closely than she realized during their quiet mornings together, asked her directly, in careful signs, whether she had ever thought about leaving nursing. She hesitated before answering, and then, for reasons she did not fully understand herself, told him about the letter still folded in her locker, about 2 years of being made to feel like an inconvenience, about how close she had come to walking away the very week he arrived. Desmond listened the way she had always listened to her mother, completely, and when she finished, he signed back slowly. I know exactly what it costs to keep translating for people who never learn to translate back. Don't let them be the reason you stop. Maya did not throw the letter away that day. She simply stopped needing to write another one. It was on a different afternoon, weeks later, that Desmond asked Marcus, almost offhandedly, to pull the records for a scholarship program the foundation had run years earlier for hearing children of deaf parents entering patient care. When he finally did show her, sliding the page across the tray table between them, Maya read her own name twice before she understood what she was looking at. The foundation that had paid her tuition, the one she had spent 6 years quietly grateful to and never able to thank, had his name buried 3 layers deep in its founding paperwork, attached to nothing public, exactly the way he had always wanted it. She did not cry the way she expected to. She simply sat very still, holding a piece of paper that meant he had already changed her life once, years before either of them had any reason to believe they would ever meet, and she understood, in that moment, that some debts really do find their way back around, whether you ever meant them to or not. Patrice Dunmore was not fired. Desmond, when asked directly whether he wanted her removed, declined, and told Marcus plainly that punishing one woman would not fix a system that had made it possible for 2 entire days to disappear like that in the first place. When Marcus relayed what Patrice had said in that office, about Curtis, about the group home, about 11 years of carrying it alone, Desmond was quiet for a long moment before he asked Marcus to arrange something else entirely, quietly, and without his name attached. A full course of grief counseling for Patrice, the kind of care he understood better than most people ever would, comes far too late for far too many people who need it. Instead, he funded, quietly, and without his name attached to it publicly, a mandatory training program for every hospital in that network, requiring documented communication, needs to be flagged and addressed within hours, not days, and requiring every floor to have immediate access to a qualified interpreter, sign language, or otherwise. Patrice completed that training herself and asked, near the end of it, if she could help design the portion dealing with disabled adult patients specifically, the first time in 11 years she had ever volunteered for anything beyond her own assigned shift. There was one afternoon, a few weeks into Desmond's recovery, when Maya brought her mother to the hospital for the first time. Denise Turner stood in that doorway the way she had stood in 100 doorways before, prepared, out of old habit, for a stranger who would not know how to include her in whatever was about to happen. Desmond stood up from his chair when he saw her, and before Maya could say a single word of introduction, he began to sign, slowly and deliberately. Thank you for raising the only person in this building who ever actually saw me. Denise's hands went still for a moment, the way hands go still when a sentence lands somewhere deeper than the ears ever could, and then she smiled and signed back, and neither woman in that room needed anyone else to translate a single word between them. In the weeks that followed, Desmond asked, carefully and without making it feel like an inspection, to see the apartment where Maya had grown up, the same rooms where Denise had spent 30 years bent over a sewing machine, building a business out of nothing more than skill and stubbornness. He said little while he was there, the way he had learned to say little in rooms that were not his to comment on uninvited. But he noticed the cramped workspace doubling as a living room, the second-hand machines held together with patience more than parts, the ceiling that leaked in one corner every time it rained hard enough. He did not mention any of it out loud that day, and neither Maya nor Denise ever knew, until much later, exactly how much that quiet visit had changed. By the following spring, a storefront on a busy corner 2 neighborhoods over had a new sign going up above its windows, and a small, unnamed foundation had quietly covered the lease. Denise Turner walked into a space 3 times the size of her old apartment, with real display windows facing the street, a team of 5 skilled seamstresses she interviewed and hired herself, and a back office with her own name on the door, a thing she had never once had before. She still sewed, some mornings, when a piece called to her specifically, but most of her days now belonged to the parts of running a business she had never had room to grow into before, meeting clients, managing orders, teaching the newer hires the techniques she had spent 3 decades perfecting alone. Sewing had become, at last, something she did purely because she loved it, not because there was no one else to do it. And not far from the new shop, in a quiet residential street with working heat and a roof that did not leak, Maya and Denise moved into a home neither of them had ever dared to put into words as something they might actually have. The grand opening drew a bigger crowd than either of them expected. Marcus was there, and Iris Calloway, and a dozen of Maya's co-workers from the hospital, including, near the back of the room and looking distinctly uncertain of her welcome, Patrice Dunmore, who came anyway because Maya had insisted on inviting her personally. Desmond stood toward the edge of the celebration, the way he preferred, letting Denise cut the ribbon herself in front of a crowd that had gathered to celebrate a woman most of them had never met, but whose daughter had quietly changed more lives in that building than she would ever fully know. If Maya Turner's story reached you the way it reached me, I would love to know. Tell me down in the comments. And if you have not already, please subscribe, because there are so many more stories like hers still waiting to be told. Thank you for watching.